that poetic license will be one of the things that reminds us uniquely of authenticity.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for listening in to Good Practice.
Where we talk about what makes good creative and good business.
From Stocksy, the artist-led visual media co-op serving the creative economy, I'm Trace Cohen, CEO.
And I'm Genevieve Ross, Creative Director, and we're your co-hosts.
In Season 2, we're asking about the evolving relationship between data and design. We know imagery shapes experience, emotion, and trust. So how are machine learning, automation, and AI transforming how creative works? Today we're speaking with Jason Madhosingh, a.k.a. Madho, a CMO with a range of global experience, solving problems by combining deep design and product and innovation experience. Just the kind of person that we like to speak with on the Good Practice podcast. Jason Madho describes himself as an empath to a fault, very much a heart-led leader who excels at understanding and applying deep customer insights and coaching teams to success. Through his consultancy, Madgood, which is how I know Madho initially, founded in 2017, very much focused on value creation for social good. Madho's consulted dozens of startups, other companies on the road to product market magic. He co-founded Xendo, a UK-based software company, which is simplifying cross-border tax compliance and payments for small creative and e-commerce businesses. Madho has spent the better part of the last decade as a marketing leader in China's burgeoning financial sector. Madho is deeply committed to business as a force for good and also serves on the board of Taproot Foundation and is an advisor to Democracy Works. Welcome, Madho. Thanks so much for joining us. And to start, if you could open a little window into your working world for us by telling us how empathy and listening have been informing some of the work that you've been doing lately.
Great. Thank you for such a lovely intro, by the way. And Jen and Trace, it's really nice to see you both. I think when I self-describe as an empath to a fault, believe it or not, it's scientifically proven. So, I don't know how many of these personality tests you've done in your career. I've done a lot. I am a ENFP on Myers-Briggs. I'm an Enneagram type 7, if you know that one. I'm a hub in the strategic strengths deployment inventory.
What are the trays of a 7 in an Enneagram?
I also happen to be an Aquarius if you're a horoscope or an astrology follower, but they all kind of flow, no water sign pun intended, together. Deep feeling, very, very extroverted, very insightful about people. And I think over the years, I've had to really kind of understand where that can be a superpower. And I've done a lot of work in customer insights. It turns out that I'm pretty good at pulling together teams, no matter the function. And these are about, being able to talk to people and really listen to people to hear what they're about. I think the other traits that kind of flow in there are, I have a pretty wide range of creative ideas, and being able to capture those and convert those is something I have to keep myself honest about pretty consistently. But one of the challenges of being an empath is that, there are lots of personality types where, empathy is valued. There's some where it's not, and there are even some personalities where there's actually quite a bit of conflict. So empaths and narcissists are a famously bad duo together. The narcissist takes, the empath gives, and it's a bad combo all the way around. And so, it's important to understand like your strengths, but also how to protect yourself and hedge your own natural abilities and instincts so that you can be a better manager and a better person. One of the things that I love to do is pull together teams. And the tricky thing about pulling together teams is number one, you want to have people who are going to collaborate really, really effectively together. And you also want to, well, I also want to work with people who are fundamentally good people. And so I've built every interview that I've given in the last, 5 or 6 years around really two fundamental questions. Number one is, tell me what your vision of success looks like in the next 2 years. What are you going to do that's going to make you feel professionally fulfilled, personally fulfilled? What's going to make you happy? And 2 years is a good amount of time to talk about, especially in the context of a job. And then the second question is, and tell me about the people that you want to do that with. Like, who helps you thrive? Who helps you do the best work that you can? And the common thing I tell every team that I bring in is I want to put you in position where you can do the best work of your career so far. And that's sort of my implicit promise back. And the only way to get to that is to really take that time in the interview process to get to a point of truth around beliefs and values and ambitions. And, when those things line up, the rest of it melts away.
Just reflecting on one piece, it's interesting, Meta, how you describe, in this instance, you were talking about in team building, how you rely on both explicit and implicit cues. And then when you self-describe as both an empath and an extrovert, I can see how those two would come together in beautiful harmony.
Just approaching it from this localized perspective, like instead of team building from the top down, but how everybody is interconnected. And we've talked in the past about how the strength of a community or a group can only be measured but by the strength of bonds between individuals and nodes, if you're thinking about like network effects, and getting the time to really understand how people work and how they communicate. Since we all communicate so differently and there's so much opportunity for miscommunication. And I was also thinking, as well as being a great leader and a great manager, I bet you're a great guest at parties, because you don't walk in and just ask what somebody does, but like, what's your Enneagram, which is trying to figure out more about like what makes somebody tick, instead of being like, what are your hobbies? Do you know what I mean? I've always struggled with those personality tests because they're always kind of created or given to you in this context of work and trying to figure out how you best apply yourself to a career or a workplace. How you think about that integration with bringing your values into a more kind of holistic framework.
What a great thoughtful question. I find that there's two things that anchor me. One is there is literally no one in the world better at being you than you. So you may as well just be you. I think being yourself and being your authentic self is an expression, again, of going back to the first comment around, like, it's an expression of truth. And I think that that's really important anchoring for me. The other thing that I think about a lot is there's a joke about macroeconomics, and the joke is, in the long run, we're all dead, right? Like, that's the economist's joke. But it's pretty true, like it's a great thing to remember that, yeah, it's father time is undefeated. So, we've got a limited amount of time here. we may as well make the best of it. And the best way to do that is try and do good things, try and make the world a little bit better for everybody that's in your life, whether they're in your personal life or your work life or both. And, that's the best we can do.
Yeah, I really like that idea of just having anchoring points, because I have a few of those where you can get carried off in so many different directions with your what might be like the North Star for that moment or that quarter. But just having those anchor points that remind you of what's real and what's most important is something we've also been talking about in relation to the whole signs of life concept that we're covering in this podcast, but also we've just done an event on it, and that also is a extrapolation of what we can hold on to in terms of creativity in this moment, and how is creativity thriving and where is it thriving in 2025 when elsewhere it's kind of being referred to as more in eulogy. So
humans provide what can't be measured, right? Taste, right? Taste has been a big, an important five-letter word in the discussion at the moment as well. And the truth is, no amount of golden ratios or Fibonacci sequences can predict an emotional response, right? Like, I think we might hypothesize that they can. That poetic license will be one of the things that reminds us uniquely of authenticity. Here's a question maybe for the room. Are you going to be happier in a world with no typos or a world with typos? Because we're about to enter one where typos are almost eliminated by virtue of the tools that we use to write to each other. But yeah, but it's still uniquely human.
yeah, good question. As somebody who makes a lot of typos and annoys people with their illegible messages, that would be nice. But also, I'm wondering how long it'll take, and I think it won't take long until that component of authenticity, the ability to make mistakes and to mix things up a bit, is also going to be incorporated into AI, where they're making a typo in your article or in your copy just so that it looks like you didn't get ChatGPT to write it, which I can see, I know people do.
One of the things I'd love to learn more, it's not often, Jason, I get to speak with someone, especially on the marketing front, that has such depth of experience, in your case, marketing, as a CMO in China. And I'm curious, as we talk about this, kind of applying data and insights into creative expression, right? And needing to find that right mix. One being more head, one being more heart. And I'm curious to learn from you how that, in your kind of sort of empathic leaning leadership style, how that worked or how that was embraced in China. I mean, just since we were talking about, since we were just talking about kind of the world of perfect and imperfect, and we don't usually talk about stock on Stocksy's podcast, but you had shared with me, for example, how you were in a situation where, for example, content that was very stocky, like stocky stock, very almost inauthentic content, right? That's sort of like everybody, I always describe it as the like, people smiling in a dentist chair, or like every race represented in a board meeting, all smiling while we're looking over our Excel spreadsheets. Maybe if there were just any insights you could share with us around the distinction between the two markets and how you did find that balance between head and heart, so to speak.
Great question. I was thinking about this not too long ago, and part of me also believes it's not just head and heart. I would argue that it's I think when I was writing it out, I wrote it out as brain, heart, and soul. And the distinction being, I think the French word, which I will now butcher in front of billions of listeners, is je ne sais quoi, right? Like that part is kind of the soul, right? And so it's not just. I think there's more to it. I think certainly I can't paint a nation of literally a billion people, under any kind of brush that would make any sense. But I will say that what matters in a given culture is going to be some balance of environment, and what you sort of like grew up understanding, and how you learned to process information growing up. And one way to that kind of illustrate that is in think about the schools of type for a minute. I love typography. I think it's pretty magnificent. I grew up a massive reader of real physical books, but the thing that's really beautiful about type is like the levels of expression that happen through type. And think about the distinction between a Swiss type and for argument's sake, wingdings, right?
Sure.
Very clean, modern, minimalist versus kind of wild, kind of crazy. In China, first of all, every character is a word rather than a letter. And so like the concept of language on screen is very, very different. And the thing to think about is information density is probably one of the really big distinctions between like a Chinese specific culture and a Western culture. And I do remember, you would have sites that were endless amounts of information. And think about a PowerPoint slide that's like the best cheat sheet you ever have written for an exam. You have written the tiniest, notations and formulas across every possible square millimeter of writing space on this one sheet of paper that your professor is going to let you bring into your exam, versus a Swiss PowerPoint slide which might just have one thing on it, one word in the middle. And the information density, some argue that it traces back to early internet connectivity issues where data was passed through packets. Famously, 140 characters, is a packet size, an SMS size. And so the goal was to jam as much information as possible into that one load so that everything that you needed to know could come across at one moment. But for whatever reasons of origin, even now, the style of information design in China is very, very heavy in terms of information and factoids and everything. And you could have a web page for the same product in two different regions differ significantly for those reasons. And that in my experience in building in both places, that takes a lot of discussion, because what you're really doing is arguing that something that you've known your entire life doesn't work everywhere. And it's very like humanly counterintuitive for someone that you might not, does not have a shared experience with you to explain this. And it requires, kind of interestingly, going back to the empathy point, it requires like personal trust that the person across from you is telling you the truth, is doing it with positive intent, and is doing it, as a collaborator, as a teammate. And so these are cultural, they're cultural distinctions in information design that require like some pretty big cultural bridges and trust, guangxi, like trust to make it all work. And it's pretty fascinating. It's one of the things I've loved about working with people from different cultures all over the world, is trying to learn and unpack and figure out, the how in the communication. It does require that you have human interpreters, not machine translators. And don't get me wrong, like I am a massive AI and software user. But I think like the way that I've been thinking about it is, one, how do I use it as an accelerant, um, uh, an amplifier of the things that I want to bring into the world, the ideas that I want to bring into the world, and how does it help me sharpen those ideas or communicate them more effectively or bridge gaps in knowledge that I couldn't reasonably, close by myself. And so, for me, like I'm finding that these tools are helpful in growing my practice of creativity. And don't get me wrong, like, I did a year of art school, but I also studied data science. And, I've got this weird combination of things going through my brain, as my wife will attest to. But the idea being that all of these become tools for us to hopefully bridge gaps between humans, and gaps in culture, gaps in information design, gaps in, information density, so that we can communicate more effectively and efficiently and proficiently with each other.
Yeah, I really love that. I mean, so often we talk about kind of this move to homogeneity or monoculturalism as a bad thing. And of course, there are very definitive reasons why we lose diversity in the process. And as you say, it's also a significant bridge builder.
When I first came to Stocksy, there was, just going back to kind of what you're talking about with locality, is some of the editors were a little bit dubious that some clients, Australian clients, were like being too picky. They're like, this doesn't look like Australian light to me. Like, the light's different there. And I was like, well, actually, they have a really good point, because I grew up in New Zealand, and there are just like those subtle environmental differences that speak volumes to authenticity. All of these kind of like subtle visual cues. And I wondered, because you've worked globally with so many different markets, how much variation you see in terms of like the more of like the visual grammar of the imagery that you use, or the style that translates.
Yeah, it's great question. I think I had the good fortune at learning brand management at the Walt Disney Company, earlier in my career. And I was working on, just incredible stuff that, to work on things that involve Mickey Mouse or Winnie the Pooh, or even The Incredibles, which I worked on The Incredibles on ice, if you can believe that, which is pretty amazing. And we had a partner, at the time, that would take these Disney characters, beloved Disney characters, and be responsible for bringing them to life in China, in India, in all other parts of the world. And sometimes bringing them to life means a newspaper advertisement, right? Like, it's all pretty incredible. And I worked with a woman named Kathy, who was the creative director, and literally the partners would send over 150 ads, and Kathy would look at it and say, change that, change that, change that, Mickey wouldn't do that, Goofy wouldn't do that. And it was unbelievable, like, to see how she had, through her multiple decades of working across like this portfolio, understood every single nuance of these characters and how they would be positioned, how they might stand, what they might be doing, etc., to be able to look through stuff so quickly and articulate it, and articulate the change needed. I think even when you look at the localization is not translation. But if you look at the localization for other firms, like, I think Nike and Coke have their strategies on how they do it. And on one hand, it's, for Nike, it's just do it everywhere. But translating that into the campaign that is happening in Portland or is happening in Shanghai can be totally different, because it is an interpretation. And the only way to get to that truth of interpretation is to have local knowledge, local insight, local understanding, of, how information should be conveyed in order to get the right sentiment across. I think everything requires local knowledge, insight, and acceptance in order for the message to come across. And a lot of that is data. It just happens to be qualitative data, and you're not going to find it on a spreadsheet. You're very unlikely to find it in a software program, although they're better. And, I think you're more likely to find it in a history book or in reading. I've read hundreds of Chinese proverbs. All of this is data. And, one of my favorite passages that I've read is by this guy named Thomas Merton, who wrote a little tiny book about Gandhi. And this tiny book about Gandhi, he goes into some depth at explaining the difference between the East and the West at that moment in time. And I think Gandhi's framing of it was that the West came into the East as a one-eyed giant, science without wisdom. And what I find to be pretty fascinating about this moment is, how do we not give away, but how do we let the science happen and contribute the wisdom? And refocusing, like, on doing those things in my own personal, life and creative pursuits and work pursuits, I'm finding to be an empowering way to balance these things and, do better work with a broader range of people, and make sure that my ideas can be translated or localized effectively.
In a current, let's just call it a current GPT world, I think one of the things that's really interesting, Dr. Paul Brody, who's a psychiatrist and was one of the speakers at our Signs of Life event last week, was talking, for example, as a psychiatrist, from the perspective of a psychiatrist, how, AI therapy has become a thing, right? Literally, like, relying on an AI as your best friend, ask them questions. I'm thinking of asking this guy out, what should I do? Kind of getting literal, advice from an AI agent. And just a reminder in terms of the science without wisdom, any advice you're getting, any emotional advice, is coming from an entity that has no lived experience. Science without wisdom. And I think the sooner that we get to learn to rely on AI for its strengths and not our gullibility and its emotional intelligence, the smarter we will be.
It's a great point. I mean, I think like, going back to to Jen's question, right? Like it's, um, I think the best global brands are going to find a path working with incredible local creative partners who understand how to translate a brand ethos, through whatever means of expression across cultures. It's not about forcing a single message everywhere. It's about, finding that human thread, that authentic thread, that piece of truth, that connects us all.
We've been talking about, and we know that real always resonates, right? That authenticity is ultimately what wins hearts and minds, and that as emerging tools, as emerging automation AI tools further embed into creative workflows, question for you, Madho, on what's your take on how design integrates these tools at scale while keeping human imagination central?
It's a great question. I think human connection is unparalleled, first of all, and I think unreplicable. Even when you have a human across from you, you could not connect with that human. As millions of current Tinder subscribers would tell you, the idea, that we have certainly some universal human truths, safety, belonging, growth, purpose, you know, how those manifest in whatever environment you are may differ. How that's expressed may differ. And I think the best creative expressions are going to continue to have, you know, that local and human insight that bring it back to this piece of truth, right? What is that human component, that human element, that human thread, that works, that connects all of this back to us. Um, and that is, I don't think that's going to change in our lifetime in the long run.
Well, Madho, I very much know you through the lens of Madgood and have always known you as, in terms of my understanding of what drives you and motivate and what motivates you in business is the idea of business as a force for good. Tell us about your perspective toward that notion of business as a force for good and maybe how it's evolved in recent years or what you've been learning, how it's challenged any previous working patterns of that idea.
Great question. Thank you for asking it. This is a very important area for me that I've reflected a lot on. I would say over the last, actually exactly over the last decade. I think when we had our first daughter, shout out to Raina, we had our first daughter, the big mental shift that occurred to me was a better understanding of opportunity cost, right? Because every minute that I'm not, every minute I'm away from home, I'm not with this being that has just entered my life. And that's a pretty monumental moment of shift. The second major shift was when our second daughter, shout out to Layla, was born, and then it was about not just every minute away being different, but what am I doing? How am I improving the world around me at that moment? And I took what what I referred to as a marketer as my social impact sabbatical. My wife referred to it as a midlife crisis. And, I spent a year just wanting to work with social impact entrepreneurs and nonprofits and firms that were doing good. And I had a long history of being a volunteerism. I was volunteering with the Muscular Dystrophy Association from the time I was around 15 until the time I was 31 as a camp counselor. And then I woke up one day and I was like, oh my God, I'm 30 years old and I'm going to camp. I got to find a different way to give back here. And that was a moment of changing my perspective. And then I started working on nonprofit boards and doing things in that space. And ultimately, I think over the last 10 years, what I've come to understand and feel is that, number one, just as a general thesis of business, and it's it's very Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett to say it, but, good business creates value for all stakeholders, like period, point blank, like that's just good business. Right. And I think where that's matured is thinking about, good business as creating sustainable value for all stakeholders, and that sustainable value could come in a lot of different ways. B Corps are, that movement has been really critical in kind of reshaping the narrative and moving the needle. And I think if we as humanity believe that we can do this, that this is a thing that we want to do, then we have the motivation we need to take those many, many individual small actions to get there. So that would be my hope, would be that this becomes a part of the way that we think about business. Think about creating value, think about doing good generally, and think about the one good thing that you can do today through your work to help make the world just a tiny little bit better. Those compounding things make just massive change happen, even if it's not things that we see tomorrow.
I love it. Just thanks so much from us here at the Good Practice Podcast on sharing your good values and your awesome and optimistic, I might add, views of how we can create the kinds of shifts we know we all need to see.
Thanks, Trace, for giving me a chance to chat and reflect and meet some pretty lovely people at Stocksy.
Thank you for listening. We hope you'll follow along or subscribe to Good Practice.
Good Practice is brought to you by Stocksy, the internet's first and only artist-owned cooperative stock media agency.